The morning of May 14th, 2025, broke over the Himalayas with a deceptive tranquility. At 30,000 feet, the air over the Kashmir Valley is thin, frigid, and unforgiving. A place where the jagged teeth of the Karakoram Range pierce the cloud layer like shattered glass. For decades, this airspace has been the most militarized zone on the planet, a perpetual flashpoint between nuclear neighbors. But on this specific Wednesday, the silence was not just the absence of noise, it was the holding of breath before a scream. At 0600 hours, deep within Indian airspace, a flight of 4 delta-winged shadows detached themselves from the sunrise and turned north. They were the pride of the Indian Air Force, the Dassault Rafale, flying under the call sign Sword Flight. Their mission was officially designated as a punitive strike on suspected militant training camps across the line of control, a calculated show of force intended to remind Islamabad of New Delhi's aerial dominance. To the pilots of Sword Flight, this mission was expected to be routine, perhaps even clinical. They were flying the Omni-Roll fighter, a machine marketed by France as the pinnacle of 4.5 generation technology. They sat in cockpits lined with glass touchscreens and holographic displays, cocooned in the belief of their own invincibility. For years, defense analysts and military journals had lauded the Rafale as the superior beast of the Asian skies, a jet that had eaten American F-16s and Russian Su-35s for breakfast in training exercises. The Indian pilots trusted their Spectra electronic warfare suite, a system rumored to be so advanced it could jam enemy radars before they even achieved a lock. As they crossed the line of control, their confidence was absolute. They believed they were the predators entering a pen of sheep. They expected, at most, a scramble of aging F-16s or the older JF-17 Thunder's aircraft they considered relics of a bygone era. They were wrong. Across the border, at Pakistan Air Force Base Minas, the morning routine was shattered not by the rising sun, but by the shrieking wail of the scramble klaxon. The radar screens in the Sector Operations Center had lit up with the distinct electronic signatures of the intruders, but the response was not the F-16. Instead, the hangar doors rolled open to reveal the silhouette of a different predator. The number 15 squadron, known as the Cobras, was the elite unit tasked with the defense of the capital, and they were equipped with the Chengdu J-10C. This was the export variant of China's Vigorous Dragon, a single-engine fighter that Western observers had often dismissed as a budget alternative, a poor man's F-16. The world was about to learn that budget does not mean benign. Within minutes, 4 J-10Cs roared down the runway, their afterburners glowing like molten diamonds against the gray tarmac. Under their delta wings, they carried a heavy load, the jagged, sinister shapes of the PL-15E long-range air-to-air missiles. As the Pakistani jets climbed rapidly to Angels 30, punching through the cloud deck, the pilots did not turn on their radars. This was the first sign that the rules of the game had changed. They flew in total electronic silence, guided only by the encrypted data stream beaming down from a friendly AWACS circling safe within their own territory. They were flying blind by choice, ghosts in the machine, sliding into position to execute an ambush that had been rehearsed in simulators for 3 years. Back in the cockpit of Sword 1, the flight leader of the Indian formation scanned his instruments. His radar warning receiver was quiet. The Spectra system showed green across the board. The sky ahead seemed empty. "Clean sweep," he murmured over the encrypted channel, his voice laced with the casual arrogance of a man flying a $100 million asset. He believed that if the Pakistanis were out there, his sensors would have screamed by now. He did not realize that the silence was the trap. The Rafales pushed deeper, crossing 40 kilometers into Pakistani territory, their cameras searching for ground targets. They were looking down, unaware that death was already hurtling towards them from the front. The engagement, when it happened, did not unfold like a scene from a Hollywood movie. There was no spiraling dogfight, no visual identification, no nightly duel with machine guns. It was a cold, mathematical execution. 140 kilometers away, the Pakistani J-10Cs received the final authorization. The Cobras opened their fire control channels. In a split second, the data link handed off the target coordinates to the missiles. 4 PL-15 missiles dropped from the rails, their dual-pulse motors igniting with a blinding flash before accelerating to Mach 4. The J-10Cs immediately turned away, diving back towards the safety of the mountains, never once exposing themselves to the Rafale's return fire. For the Indian pilots, the nightmare began 70 seconds later. The first warning was not a blip on a radar screen, but the sudden, terrifying screech of the missile launch warning system. By the time the onboard computers registered the incoming threat, the missiles were already in the terminal phase, their active radar seekers burning through the thin air. "Brake left! Brake left! Missile inbound!" The radio channel dissolved into chaos. Sword 1 and Sword 2 dumped flares and chaff, banking hard to the deck, pushing their engines to the limit. They activated the vaunted Spectra jamming system, expecting it to confuse the missile's brain, to veer it off course as the brochures had promised. But the Chinese seekers held firm. They hopped frequencies, ignoring the electronic noise, locked onto the heat and the metal with pitiless precision. The first missile struck Sword 2 directly in the fuselage. There was no explosion, simply a disintegration. One moment, the Rafale was a marvel of French engineering. The next, it was a cloud of burning composite and titanium raining down onto the snow-capped peaks below. The pilot never had a chance to eject. Sword 1, witnessing his wingman vanish in a fireball, pulled 7 Gs in a desperate climb, trying to outrun the kinetic energy of the second missile. It was futile. The PL-15, fueled by its second rocket pulse, closed the distance with terrifying speed. It detonated its proximity fuse 20 meters from the aircraft. The shockwave sheared off the Rafale's vertical stabilizer and starboard wing. The aircraft entered a flat spin, tumbling like a broken toy. The flight leader managed to punch out, his parachute blooming white against the stark blue sky, the only survivor of the lead element. The remaining 2 Rafales, Sword 3 and 4, stunned and blinded by the sudden ferocity of the attack, did not fight. They did not try to avenge their fallen comrades. The psychological shock of seeing the invincible jet swatted from the sky so effortlessly shattered their cohesion. They jettisoned their fuel tanks and payloads, turning tail and burning hard for the border, fleeing the invisible assassins that lurked in the north. They had been prepared for a fight. They were not prepared for a slaughter. By the time the sun fully illuminated the wreckage smoking on the mountainside, the news had already circled the globe. In the situation rooms of Washington, Paris, and London, the initial reports were met with disbelief. Intelligence officers asked for confirmation, assuming it was a mistake, a friendly fire incident, or a ground-based surface-to-air missile. Rafales don't just get shot down, was the prevailing sentiment. But as the gun camera footage from the Pakistani J-10Cs was leaked showing the clean, beyond visual range kills, the disbelief turned to horror. The shockwave was instantaneous. In Paris, the stock price of Dassault Aviation plummeted 15% in a single hour of trading. Defense ministers canceled meetings to huddle with their generals. The narrative of Western technological supremacy, carefully curated since the end of the Cold War, had cracked. The J-10C, a jet that cost a fraction of the Rafale, had not just survived, it had dominated. The Cobra squadron had proven that the era of the expensive show pony fighter was over. The world woke up to a new reality on May 14th. The Dragon was not just breathing fire, it was rewriting the laws of aerial warfare. And as the wreckage of the Rafales cooled in the Kashmir snow, the question on everyone's lips was no longer whether the Chinese technology worked. The question was, how did they do it? How did a mass-produced backbone fighter humiliate the pride of Europe? To understand that, we must peel back the skin of the engagement and look at the invisible war that was fought and won before the first missile was even fired. To understand how the pride of the Indian Air Force was dismantled in a matter of seconds, we must look beyond the jagged peaks of the Himalayas and the burning wreckage on the ground. We must look up, into the stratospheric stillness hundreds of kilometers away from the engagement zone. The destruction of the Rafales was not merely a result of the missile that struck them or the fighter that launched it. Those were simply the kinetic endpoints of a much larger, invisible architecture. The true architect of the ambush was a slow-moving, propeller-driven aircraft orbiting safely deep within Pakistani airspace, tracing lazy circles in the sky. This was the concept of the invisible net, and on the morning of May 14, 2025, it proved that, in the 21st century, the network is far deadlier than the individual platform. The narrative of air combat has long focused on the knights of the sky, the fighter pilots and their agile jets dueling in visual range. But the engagement over Kashmir was decided by a different kind of warrior. The mission commanders aboard the Pakistan Air Force's Airborne Warning and Control System, or AWACS. While the J-10Cs were the executioners, the eyes of the operation were likely provided by the Saab 2000 Aerial, or the Chinese-made ZDK-03 Karakoram Eagle. These aircraft carry massive dorsal radar arrays capable of seeing over the curvature of the Earth and looking down into the valleys that usually hide low-flying intruders. On that fateful morning, long before the Indian Rafales even crossed the line of control, the Pakistani AWACS had already picked them up. To the high-altitude radar of the Aerial, the Rafales were not stealthy shadows. They were distinct electronic blips moving against the backdrop of the mountains. This God's eye view created a lethal information asymmetry. The Indian pilots were flying into enemy territory, relying on their onboard sensors, their nose-mounted radars, and their passive electronic warning suites. However, onboard radars are limited by physics. They can only see what is directly in front of them, and they are blocked by terrain. The Pakistani AWACS, looking down from 30,000 feet, suffered no such limitations. It saw the entire chessboard. It saw the vector of the Indian strike package, their altitude, their speed, and even their likely destination. And critically, it saw them without the Indian pilots ever knowing they were being watched. The AWACS radar operates on frequencies and at distances that often do not trigger the immediate lock-on warnings in a fighter cockpit until the trap is already sprung. This brings us to the tactical innovation that sealed the fate of the Rafales, the A-shoot-B guide capability, enabled by advanced data linking. In previous generations of aerial warfare, if a fighter jet like the J-10C wanted to shoot down an enemy, it had to turn on its own fire control radar. It had to blast the sky with high-energy radio waves to find and lock onto the target. The problem with this traditional method is that it is the electronic equivalent of turning on a massive spotlight in a dark forest. As soon as a fighter turns on its radar, it announces its presence. The enemy's radar warning receiver screams, "I see you," and the element of surprise is lost. The enemy knows where you are, and they can jam you or shoot back. On May 14th, the Pakistani Cobra Squadron did something that the Indian pilots did not anticipate. They kept their radars off. The pilots of the J-10Cs flew in total electromagnetic silence, a state known as emission control, or EMCON. To the electronic warfare sensors of the Rafales, the airspace ahead appeared completely empty. There were no radar emissions to detect, no electronic spikes to jam. It was a void. But it was a populated void. The J-10Cs were receiving a constant stream of encrypted, high-bandwidth data beamed directly from the AWACS via a secure Link 17 tactical data link. The AWACS acted as the spotter, tracking the Rafales in real time and feeding those precise coordinates to the computers of the J-10Cs. This transformed the J-10C from a hunter into a sniper. The pilots did not need to search the sky. The sky was being painted for them on their digital displays. They saw the red icons of the enemy fighters moving closer, updated millisecond by millisecond by the orbiting eye in the rear. They maneuvered their aircraft into the perfect intercept geometry, flanking the Indian formation to maximize the kill probability. The Indian Rafale pilots, meanwhile, were effectively flying into a dark room where waiting assassins were wearing night vision goggles. They were victims of a kill box, a pre-designated zone of airspace where the defenders had established total informational dominance. The arrogance of the Rafale pilots was rooted in the belief that their Spectra electronic warfare suite would protect them. But Spectra is primarily a reactive system. It is designed to jam and confuse enemy radars that it detects. It cannot jam a radar that is not transmitting. It cannot fight a ghost. The ambush was sprung with mathematical precision. The J-10Cs closed the distance at supersonic speeds, still silent, still invisible to the electronic spectrum. They only broke silence at the very last possible second, and even then, they did not necessarily need to use their own radars to achieve the initial launch. The data provided by the AWACS was precise enough to initialize the inertial guidance systems of the PL-15 missiles. The J-10Cs released their weapons based on the track file provided by the network. It was only after the missiles were airborne, screaming towards their targets at Mach 4, that the active radar seekers in the nose of the missiles turned on. By then, the geometry of the engagement had collapsed. The no-escape zone had already enveloped the Indian fighters. This operational reality highlights a terrifying evolution in Chinese-supplied military doctrine. For years, Western analysts dismissed Chinese avionics as inferior copies of Russian or Western tech. The Kashmir shock proved that China had mastered the most difficult aspect of modern war: integration. The ability to seamlessly fuse data from a strategic asset like an AWACS with a tactical asset like a fighter jet is complex. It requires robust software, jam-resistant frequencies, and high-speed processing. The successful downing of the Rafales demonstrated that the invisible net, woven by Pakistani and Chinese engineers, was not just functional. It was superior to the situational awareness of the isolated Indian jets. The psychological impact of this tactic on the surviving Indian pilots cannot be overstated. Imagine the terror of flying a state-of-the-art combat aircraft, with every sensor reading clear, only to see your wingman disintegrate. It creates a paralysis of decision-making. If your sensors tell you there is no enemy, but you are dying, you lose faith in your machine. You panic. The survivors of sword flight retreated not because they were out of ammunition, but because they were fighting an enemy they could not perceive. They were trapped in an information vacuum, while their adversaries were operating with perfect clarity. In the aftermath analysis, military historians would realize that the J-10C was merely the end effector of a massive system. The Rafale was not defeated by a single pilot's skill, or even by the airframe's agility. It was defeated by the architecture of the battle. The J-10C acted as a remote-controlled launch platform, a missile truck that extended the reach of the AWACS. This A-shoot-B-guide capability renders the traditional advantages of Western fighters like superior dogfighting maneuverability completely irrelevant. It does not matter how tight a Rafale can turn if it is shot down from 100 kilometers away by an enemy it never saw. The invisible net forces a rewriting of air combat doctrine. It suggests that in the wars of the future, the side with the better network will slaughter the side with the better individual jets. The J-10C, often derided for its lower cost, proved that a networked, mass-produced fighter is infinitely more dangerous than an isolated technological marvel. As we move to examine the specific instrument of destruction in the next part of our analysis, the missile itself, we must remember that the missile was only successful because the net allowed it to be. The PL-15 did not find the target on its own. It was guided by the invisible hand of a data link that turned the empty sky into a lethal trap. This was the setup. Now, we must look at the execution. The duel between the European Meteor and the Chinese Thunderbolt that decided the fate of the morning. In the high-stakes arena of modern air combat, the aircraft is often the celebrity, but the missile is the executioner. While the intricate dance of data links and radar traps set the stage for the ambush over Kashmir, the final verdict was delivered by a clash of technologies that military engineers had been debating for decades. This was the moment the theoretical simulations collided with the brutal reality of physics. It was the duel between the European Meteor and the Chinese PL-15E, two weapons representing fundamentally different philosophies of long-range destruction. For the Indian Rafale pilots, the morning of May 14th was supposed to be a showcase of the Meteor's dominance, a ramjet-powered marvel that had been marketed as the world's undisputed king of beyond visual range engagement. Instead, they found themselves staring down the barrel of a weapon that rewrote the geometry of the sky. To understand why the engagement ended in tragedy for the sword flight, one must appreciate the technological pedigree of the combatants. The Meteor, carried by the Rafale, is a masterpiece of European engineering. Unlike traditional rockets, it breathes air. It utilizes a solid-fuel ramjet engine that allows it to throttle its speed, conserving fuel during the cruise phase and saving energy for the final endgame maneuvering. It was designed specifically to have the largest no-escape zone of any missile in existence, a weapon that could chase down a fleeing enemy for over 100 kilometers without running out of breath. In the minds of the Indian Air Force planners, this gave them a definitive edge. They believed that even if the Pakistanis fired first, the Meteor's superior kinematics would allow them to shoot back and win the energy war. However, the J-10Cs were armed with the PL-15E, the export variant of China's premier air-to-air missile, the Thunderbolt. The PL-15 rejects the complexity of the ramjet in favor of a dual-pulse solid rocket motor. It carries its own oxidizer, meaning it does not need to breathe the thin Himalayan air to generate thrust. When the Pakistani Cobras received the targeting data from their AWACS, they were 140 kilometers away from the Indian formation. In a traditional engagement, firing from this distance is considered a Hail Mary, a desperate shot with a low probability of kill. But the PL-15 was built for exactly this kind of extreme-range sniping. When the J-10Cs released their weapons, the first pulse of the PL-15's motor ignited, hurling the missiles upward. They did not fly in a straight line. They followed a lofted ballistic trajectory, climbing rapidly into the near space of the stratosphere, reaching altitudes where the air resistance is almost non-existent. Up there, in the thin, freezing void, the missiles cruised at hypersonic speeds, converting their altitude into kinetic energy. They became silent meteors falling upon their prey from the heavens. This lofting capability effectively extended the reach of the J-10C well beyond the theoretical engagement envelope of the Rafale. The range gap became the defining factor of the skirmish. As the Pakistani missiles tipped over and began their terminal dive towards the Indian jets, the Rafale pilots were caught in a deadly mathematical squeeze. They detected the incoming attack, but they were still too far away to return fire effectively. Their Meteors, for all their ramjet sophistication, still needed to close the distance to ensure a high probability of kill against the maneuvering J-10Cs. The Indian pilots were forced to make a catastrophic choice: continue flying forward into the teeth of the attack to get into range, or turn and run, abandoning their mission. Driven by aggression and training, they initially tried to press the attack, attempting to close the final 20 kilometers needed to unleash their own missiles. This decision proved fatal because they underestimated the lethal intelligence of the PL-15's propulsion system. As the Chinese missiles dropped into the thicker air of the lower atmosphere, closing in on the Rafales, they did not arrive as coasting, exhausted rounds. The onboard computers sensed the proximity of the targets and ignited the second pulse of the rocket motor. This feature is the heart of the PL-15's lethality. Just as the missile should have been slowing down, it suddenly accelerated again, rocketing from Mach 3 to Mach 4.5 in the blink of an eye. For the Rafale pilots, this sudden injection of energy destroyed their defensive calculations. A pilot defending against a missile relies on draining the missile's energy, forcing it to turn hard, climb, or chase until it falls out of the sky. But when the PL-15 ignited its second stage, it regained a massive energy advantage. It expanded the no-escape zone, the volume of space where no amount of maneuvering can save the aircraft to engulf the Rafales completely. The Indian jets were flying into a wall of kinetic fury. They were trying to fight a boxing match against an opponent who had brought a sniper rifle. The J-10Cs had fired from a sanctuary of distance that the Rafales simply could not breach in time. Furthermore, the environment of the Himalayas played a subtle but critical role in the victory of the PL-15's guidance system. The thin air and the complex background clutter of the snowy peaks create a nightmare scenario for radar seekers. Older missiles often lose lock when a target flies low against the mountains, the radar confusing the aircraft with the rocks. However, the PL-15E is equipped with a miniature active electronically scanned array seeker, a piece of technology that mirrors the main radar of the J-10C itself. This digital eye is incredibly resistant to clutter. As the Rafales broke formation and dove towards the hard deck, attempting to hide in the ground clutter of the Kashmir valleys, the Chinese seekers did not blink. The AESA seekers utilized advanced algorithms to distinguish the Doppler shift of the fleeing Rafales from the static background of the mountains. They locked onto the specific radar cross-section of the French jets with a tenacity that the older generation of mechanical seekers could never achieve. The Rafales deployed chaff clouds of aluminum strips designed to blind radar, but the PL-15's seeker head, possessing smart processing, instantly recognized the decoys as stationary objects and ignored them, keeping its focus on the moving targets. The technological disparity was glaring. The Rafale's defensive suite, designed to counter Russian missiles from the 2000s, was unprepared for the digital agility of a Chinese missile from the 2020s. The impact of the missiles was the final punctuation mark on a sentence written by superior strategy. The destruction of the two Rafales was not just a loss of airframes. It was the shattering of the meteor myth. For years, Western defense circles had comforted themselves with the belief that while China might build many jets, their missiles were inferior copies. The Kashmir engagement proved that the PL-15 was not a copy of anything. It was a purpose-built Rafale killer that leveraged dual-pulse technology to dominate the energy fight at extreme ranges. The verdict of May 14th was clear. In the era of networked warfare, the fighter that shoots first wins. The J-10C, by utilizing the PL-15E, was able to dictate the terms of the engagement completely. It forced the Rafale to react, to defend, and ultimately to die, without ever having the opportunity to use its own vaunted weaponry. The Meteor might have been a superior missile on paper, or in a one-on-one duel starting at closer ranges, but in the real-world tactical scenario of a beyond visual range ambush, the PL-15's range and terminal speed reigned supreme. As the surviving Indian pilots turned their backs on the burning wreckage of their wingmen, retreating to the safety of their own airspace, they carried with them a terrifying realization. The technological gap had closed. The vigorous Dragon did not need to dogfight. It did not need to turn and burn. It simply needed to see, to launch, and to leave. The long arm of the J-10C had reached out across 140 kilometers of freezing sky and slapped the pride of the West out of the air. But as the dust settled, another question began to rise from the debris. If the missile was the spear and the network was the arm, what happened to the shield? Why did the Rafale's legendary electronic warfare suite, the Spectra, fail to stop the inevitable? This failure of the invisible shield would become the most controversial and studied aspect of the entire conflict. To comprehend the full magnitude of the disaster that befell the Indian Air Force on that cold May morning, we must peel back the skin of the aircraft and examine the nervous system underneath. While the PL-15 missile was the physical arrow that pierced the armor, the true defeat occurred in the invisible, silent realm of the electromagnetic spectrum. For over a decade, the Dassault Rafale has been marketed to the world not just as a fighter jet, but as a flying fortress of electronic warfare. Its primary defensive suite, known as Spectra self-protection equipment countering threats to Rafale aircraft, was legendary. Developed by Thales, Spectra was widely considered the finest integrated electronic warfare system in the Western world. A digital shield capable of jamming, spoofing, and blinding enemy radars with terrifying efficiency. Pilots often joked that with Spectra active, they were flying in a stealth bubble, invisible to the clumsy sensors of Russian or Chinese origin. But on May 14, 2025, that bubble burst. The shield failed. And to understand why, we must introduce the silent assassin that dismantled it, the KL-J-7A active electronically scanned array radar. The engagement over Kashmir was the first true high-intensity test of Western electronic warfare against top-tier Chinese avionics, and the results sent shockwaves through the corridors of NATO intelligence. The failure of Spectra was not a result of a malfunction or a software bug. It was a fundamental mismatch of generations. Spectra was designed in the late 1990s and modernized in the 2000s with a specific threat library in mind. It was built to counter the brute force, high-power mechanical radars of the Cold War era, the kinds found on the Su-30, the MiG-29, and the older J-11. These radars are powerful, but they are predictable. They operate on known frequencies and scan the sky with a rhythmic, mechanical predictability. Spectra defeats them by listening to their signal, memorizing it, and then shooting back a poisoned signal that confuses the enemy radar, making the Rafale appear to be in a different location, or creating a wall of static noise. However, the J-10C flown by the Pakistan Air Force was not using a mechanical radar. It was equipped with the KL-J-7A, a cutting-edge AESA radar developed by the Nanjing Research Institute of Electronics Technology. An AESA radar does not have a single transmitter dish that swivels left and right. Instead, it is composed of over 1,000 tiny, liquid-cooled transmit-receive modules, each one a miniature radar in itself. This allows the J-10C to manipulate its radar beam with a speed and agility that defies the logic of older systems. The KL-J-7A does not just broadcast on one frequency. It engages in frequency hopping. It changes its transmission frequency thousands of times per second, dancing across the electromagnetic spectrum in a chaotic, pseudo-random pattern. When the Indian Rafales activated their Spectra systems to jam the incoming J-10Cs, they found themselves trying to catch smoke with a net. Spectra would detect a radar pulse from the J-10C on a specific frequency and attempt to jam it. But by the time the jamming signal was transmitted, the J-10C's radar had already hopped to a completely different frequency, leaving the Rafale's jammer screaming into the void. The Chinese radar was moving faster than the French computer could react. This is the inherent superiority of a modern AESA system. It is a moving target. It is fluid, adaptive, and relentlessly agile. The J-10C was able to maintain a weapons-grade lock on the Rafales, despite the intense electronic noise being pumped out by the French jets. The pilots of the Cobra Squadron reported that their radar screens remained clear, the target symbols steady and unshakable, as if the enemy had no countermeasures at all. But the J-10C had another card to play, a capability known as burn through. As the Rafales desperately pumped more power into their jammers, trying to drown out the tracking signal, the KL-J-7A responded with brute force. Because the AESA radar can focus the energy of all its 1,000 modules into a single, pencil-thin beam, it can generate an immense concentration of energy on a specific point in the sky. The J-10Cs focused this beam directly on the cockpits of the Rafales. The intensity of the Chinese radar signal was so high that it literally burned through the jamming noise. It was like someone trying to whisper to distract you, and you responding by shouting through a megaphone directly into their ear. The signal-to-noise ratio tipped overwhelmingly in favor of the J-10C. The Spectra system was overwhelmed, its processors saturated by the sheer density of the incoming energy. The shield did not just crack, it shattered. The most disturbing aspect of this failure, however, was not the hardware, but the software. This brings us to the blind spot, the fatal intelligence gap that Western air forces had ignored for too long. Electronic warfare systems are only as good as their threat libraries. These are databases of enemy radar signatures that tell the computer what it is looking at and how to defeat it. For decades, Western intelligence agencies have spent billions of dollars cataloging the electronic fingerprints of Russian equipment. They know exactly what a Russian Su-35 sounds like electronically. They know the pulse repetition frequency of a Russian S-400 missile battery. Their systems are optimized to kill Russian tech. But the KLJ-7A was not Russian. It was not a copy of a Su-30 radar. It was a uniquely Chinese indigenous design, built with different algorithms, different waveforms, and a different electronic architecture. When the sensors on the Rafale detected the J-10C, they encountered a foreign language they did not speak. The specific waveforms used by the Chinese radar were likely not in the Spectra's threat library. The system did not know how to classify the threat, or more importantly, it did not have a pre-programmed jamming technique designed to counter that specific Chinese waveform. It was an unknown unknown. The Indian pilots were fighting a ghost because their computers had never been taught what the ghost looked like. This reveals the danger of the copycat narrative that has plagued Western defense analysis. For years, experts dismissed Chinese military tech as mere reverse engineering, assuming that if you could jam a Russian jet, you could jam a Chinese jet. The Kashmir Incident proved that assumption to be a fatal error. The Chinese defense industry had diverged. They had created their own lineage of avionics, their own coding languages, and their own electronic signatures. The West had spent 20 years preparing to fight the Russian bear, only to find themselves outmaneuvered by the Chinese dragon. The KLJ-7A utilized low probability of intercept techniques that were specifically designed to exploit the blind spots in Western receiver logic. It masked its signals as background noise, hiding in the static until it was too late to react. The psychological impact of this electronic defeat was devastating. The pilot of a modern fighter jet relies on his instruments more than his eyes. He trusts the green light on his jammer to keep him safe. When that light stayed green, but the missiles hit anyway, that trust was broken. The J-10C proved that in the modern era, you cannot buy superiority. You have to program it. The failure of the shield was a wake-up call that hardware is nothing without the correct data. The Rafale was a beautiful machine, aerodynamically perfect, but electronically, it was fighting a war from the last decade. The J-10C, with its AESA eyes and its indigenous brain, was fighting the war of the future. It stripped the Rafale of its stealthy pretense and left it naked in the cold Himalayan sky, a target for the kinetic fury that followed. The Cobra squadron had not just outflown the enemy, they had outcomputed them. And as the world grappled with this new reality, the strategic consequences began to ripple out from the crash sites, toppling stock markets and rewriting alliances in a way that no one had predicted. The technological victory was complete. Now came the geopolitical earthquake. The smoke from the burning wreckage in the Kashmir Valley eventually cleared, drifting away on the cold Himalayan winds. But the shockwaves generated on the morning of May 14, 2025, did not dissipate. Instead, they traveled at the speed of light through the fiber optic cables of the global financial system, slamming into the trading floors of Paris, London, and New York with the force of a kinetic weapon. In the immediate aftermath of the skirmish, as the confirmed gun camera footage began to circulate on social media, showing the unmistakable silhouette of a French-made Rafale disintegrating under the impact of a Chinese missile, the world witnessed a different kind of crash. It was not an airframe hitting the ground, but a worldview collapsing in real time. The Kashmir shock was no longer just a military incident. It had mutated into a geopolitical earthquake that would redefine the global arms market for the remainder of the 21st century. The first casualty of this new era was the stock price of Dassault Aviation. For decades, the French aerospace giant had cultivated an image of elite exclusivity. The Rafale was marketed not merely as a weapon, but as a luxury asset, a symbol of national status that promised air superiority to any nation wealthy enough to afford its $100 million price tag. But markets are driven by confidence, and confidence is fragile. Within hours of the news breaking, panic swept through the Bourse de Paris. Investors, seeing their invincible asset swatted from the sky by a competitor, costing less than half the price, initiated a massive sell-off. The stock plummeted by nearly 20% in a single trading session, wiping billions of euros off the company's valuation. It was a brutal correction, a financial vote of no confidence that rippled outward to affect other Western defense contractors. Thales, the maker of the failed Spectre electronic warfare suite, saw similar losses. The illusion of Western technological invulnerability, which had justified the premium pricing of NATO standard equipment, had been pierced. Conversely, thousands of miles away in Beijing and Chengdu, the mood was one of quiet, calculated triumph. The Chengdu Aerospace Corporation did not need to run expensive marketing campaigns or airshow demonstrations anymore. The combat footage from Pakistan was the only advertisement they would ever need. Interest in the J-10C exploded overnight. Military attachés from nations across the Middle East, Africa, and South America countries that had long hesitated between buying used American jets or expensive European ones suddenly turned their gaze east. The phone lines at the China National Aerotechnology Import and Export Corporation began to ring incessantly. The J-10C had proven itself to be the Kalashnikov of the skies. Rugged, reliable, available, and most importantly, capable of killing the aristocracy of the air. This shift represented the dawn of a terrifying new paradigm in military strategy, the triumph of the cost-exchange ratio. For 50 years, the dominant philosophy in aerial warfare was that quality beats quantity. Western air forces argued that one expensive, high-tech fighter could defeat 10 cheap, low-tech ones. The Kashmir skirmish shattered this assumption because the J-10C was not low-tech, it was high-tech on a budget. The realization that terrified military planners was the math. For the price of a single squadron of 12 Rafales, a nation could now purchase nearly 3 squadrons of J-10Cs, complete with AWACS support and a stockpile of PL-15 missiles. In a war of attrition, numbers matter. If a $40 million Chinese jet can trade blows effectively with a $100 million Western jet, the economic logic of buying Western collapses. The J-10C democratized air superiority, allowing second-tier powers to challenge first-tier adversaries without bankrupting their national treasuries. The psychological impact of this paradigm shift cannot be overstated. It marked the end of the colonial mindset in the global arms trade, where developing nations felt compelled to buy from the West to ensure their security. The J-10C proved that the East had not just caught up, it had created a compelling alternative. The blind faith that Western is always better was replaced by a cold, hard pragmatism. Nations like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and even historic customers of American hardware began to reevaluate their procurement strategies. Why pay for a Ferrari if a Toyota can win the race? The J-10C became the symbol of this new pragmatism, a weapon that offered 90% of the capability of a fifth-generation fighter for 30% of the cost. It was the ultimate asymmetrical threat, not because of its stealth or speed, but because of its industrial sustainability. Furthermore, the geopolitical fallout reshaped the balance of power in South Asia. The victory of the Pakistan Air Force restored a sense of strategic parity to the region. The myth of Indian invincibility, bolstered by their acquisition of the Rafales and the S-400 missile systems, was severely dented. It forced New Delhi into a crisis of confidence, triggering a frantic internal review of their training, their tactics, and their reliance on foreign suppliers. It exposed the danger of buying a zoo of different aircraft types without fully mastering the networked warfare required to use them. Meanwhile, Pakistan's prestige soared. They were seen as the giant slayers, the pilots who took a Chinese sword and pierced the French shield. It solidified the Iron Brother alliance between Islamabad and Beijing, proving that Chinese hardware in Pakistani hands was a lethal combination that the world had underestimated. As we look back at the events of May 14, 2025, the conclusion is stark and undeniable. The engagement over Kashmir was not a fluke, it was a forecast. It signaled the end of the post-Cold War era where NATO technology reigned supreme and unchallenged. It heralded the arrival of a multipolar military world, where technological dominance is contested, temporary, and easily lost. The Chengdu J-10C, Vigorous Dragon, a fighter born from the necessity of defending China's skies, had matured into a global disruptor. It stripped away the veneer of marketing that protected Western defense industries and laid bare the brutal truth of modern combat. It is not the price tag that determines the victor, but the integration of sensors, weapons, and will. The dragon has officially eaten the lion. The era of unquestioned Western aerial dominance is over, buried in the snows of the Himalayas alongside the wreckage of the Rafales. We have entered the age of the high-low lethal mix, where the mass-produced, networked, and heavily armed fighters of the East stand ready to challenge the established order. The J-10C is no longer just a jet. It is a historic turning point. It is the bell tolling for the old way of war, warning every general and every politician that in the skies of the 21st century, there are no more sanctuaries, and there are no more invincible machines. The dragon is awake, and its claws are sharp, long, and relatively cheap. The world has changed, and it will never look at a budget fighter the same way again.